Okay. Just to change gears a little bit, now we're going to set the stage globally. So we set the stage globally and at an individual level in here. So in the next panel, what we want to do is hear from the experts about the trends that are happening today. And this is the focus, hopefully that this will distinguish this conference. We're not going to just talk about the trends. We're not going to just admire the problems. We want to help you find ways that you can deal with them. We'll tell you what you can do about it. I'm pleased to introduce Jonathan Nguyen. Jonathan is the Fortinet VP and the CISO field team, or VP of the CISO field team, and he's going to take some of the experts through their paces with this panel. Take it away, John.
Hello, and welcome to this session about the changing security landscape we're seeing here in 2020, how everything has changed and how things haven't changed, and why cybersecurity is just as important today as it was going into this pandemic. You know, today we're joined by a panel of really great cyber pros, and we're going to get the benefit of their insights. And I just wanted to start off by giving some observations I've seen over the last 90-odd days, and then over the last 25 years I've had in cyber. We've seen networks become completely perimeterless, if you will. We've seen networking accelerate to unheard of speeds that we never would have thought about just 3 or 4 years ago. And we've seen the level of complexity in our lives and in our businesses and in our countries expand to a level that we never imagined before. Yet all of these things now have to work together. And then going into this pandemic, we saw all of those macro trends coming together, and we saw things that were simultaneously happening as well. We saw both a shift towards centralized computing in terms of more cloud adoption and accelerated cloud adoption. At the same time, we saw more decentralized computing with the advent of remote working for 90% plus of our staffs and our teams. And suddenly now zero trust is much more prominent than ever. But at the same time, I observed a couple of things that were pretty fundamental. One, the same types of structural issues that were plaguing us as an industry were still there, in terms of basic security hygiene, misconfigurations, lack of visibility across the landscape, weaknesses in patching and vulnerability management. And it all came down consistently around gaps in visibility, gaps in awareness, and gaps in control, the ability to see what's happening, to understand it contextually, and then to act in an automated way. All of those things also compounded by the pressures of this pandemic. And so in many ways, some things have changed and some things haven't. But what's clear is that more than ever, our society and our businesses are more interconnected than ever. The level of complexity is rising, and the threat environment is also rising as well. There just simply aren't enough of us to really sustain things. So what I wanted to get at in our discussion is get the perspectives of our panels, what they're seeing, what their thoughts are around cybersecurity in the industry and in Canada in particular. In case you didn't know about Fortinet, we're the leading pure-play cybersecurity company in the industry. More than 472,000 clients and customers around the world, and everything from small, medium businesses through the Fortune 5,000 nation states. And we've got a very broad, probably the largest and deepest SASE portfolio in the industry, and we'll talk about that. But enough of me, because you're here to hear from our panelists. So Sherry, I'm going to start off with you. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, thanks, Jonathan. My name is Sherry Rumbold, and I'm a Senior Information Security Officer with the Department of National Defence and the Canadian Armed Forces in Canada. And I'm here speaking with you from Victoria, BC today.
My name is Andrew Loshman. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Field Effect. We're a cybersecurity company based out of Ottawa, and my background is in cybersecurity analytics and development, both in the government as well as commercial space.
Awesome. Steve, your turn.
Steve Winterfeld. I'm the advisory CISO for Akamai.
Yeah. And Terry?
I'm Terry Cutler. I'm the CEO and ethical hacker here at Cyology Labs, coming to you from Montreal.
Yeah. So Terry, you're a great place to start with our first question, and I wanted to get an idea from you about what are you seeing right now as the larger threats in cybersecurity? Is it spear phishing? Is it ransomware? Is it DDoS? Or is it something else that you're seeing? And then I'm going to ask the other panelists to give us their views on the same issue.
All the above. So what we're seeing mostly is, because everybody's working remote, the end users are not as protected as they are as if they're inside the corporate firewall. So what's happening is these users are connecting to all kinds of random open wirelesses or unprotected Wi-Fi's, and some of them are actually getting hacked from home, and then ransomware is being sent into the corporate environment. We're seeing a lot of credential stealing. So whenever mega breaches are happening, people aren't changing their password and they're reusing the same password everywhere. So the cyber criminals are using these passwords to log into the environment. And because these are legitimate logins, the IT or cybersecurity department isn't seeing anything, right? Because it's a proper username and password. And then once the people get in, they might be able to launch a ransomware attack.
Yeah, so much more targeted attacks trying to hit those exposed remote workers and remote locations now.
Absolutely.
That's interesting. Hey, Steve, what are you seeing in your neck of the woods?
As with any major disaster, you're seeing a huge increase in phishing attempts.
Right.
And we're all going to open that email that says updates on the COVID rules for your company. And so, with any disaster, they just take advantage of that. We're seeing an increase in denial of service attacks. Gaming industry has really been hit hard. We've seen a rash of, that blackmail for protection where we get a ransom or some kind of a note recently flare up. And then we've seen, Akamai, a lot of the different vendors, AWS are all seeing some of the biggest attacks in recent history on denial of service attacks. Yeah. And then finally, as a lot of our employees are now remote, we have to reevaluate the risk of some of the traditional threats. VPN, a very old, mature, stable way to bring people in, but we're seeing a rash of attacks against that now.
Hey, Andrew, what about you? What are you seeing from your perch?
Most of the businesses that we deal with are targeted by cyber criminals, which, by the way, are becoming incredibly sophisticated in these days. And these cyber criminals will attack what they can access, whether it's the human or whether it's the VPN endpoint that was mentioned earlier on. And they will continue to evolve. And what we're seeing is an evolution of their tradecraft so that they can achieve their objective, which is almost universally money. And so where before you get a launch of ransomware as soon as the attacker was in the network, now we're starting to see a lot more time and finesse put into understanding exactly what network was compromised, what is their ability to pay, and then what are the technical measures the attacker can use to exert as much pressure as possible on the victim.
It's becoming increasingly acceptable to pay the ransom. And whereas in the past, I used to hear lots of pros and law enforcement say, don't do it. Now I'm hearing from people who have the practical reality of keeping their organizations running. And I think as a community, I'm seeing a lot more people having serious discussions about paying the ransomware. Are you hearing about people, thinking about ways to prepare and plan for that possibility now?
Two things that are interesting. One is you've seen criminal groups that are actively managing their reputation. They want a reputation of successfully returning the information, not releasing it. And so you see hackers worried about their brand. The other thing that's been interesting is you'll now see a number of law firms that specialize in negotiating that for you.
How do we go about communicating to our families, our boards, our leadership teams that this is a real problem without being a fear monger?
It's like the whole FUD thing, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Oh, you're trying to scare me into buying new stuff. And I was going for the longest time, I'm saying, the sky's not falling, because here's why. But now it's almost like the sky's falling now, right? So I think it requires a really good education in layman's terms to the board, because these guys still think that, well, I have a firewall, I've got antivirus, I have encryption, that I'm safe. And these are all traditional technologies, traditional cybersecurity technologies. And the hackers are able to bypass this fairly easily. And they don't realize that once the hackers bypass this traditional security, they have no way of detecting that a hacker's been in their environment for 6 to 18 months prior. So they're in there siphoning out the data, and then they're saying, okay, you know what? We're going to hit them with a ransomware. They're going to hit them with a ransomware, and then they're going to say, pay us. Then the IT guys will say, well, we have a backup. We're good. Fine. Then they're going to say, pay us to not publish your data. So that's their backup plan now.
One of the things that we need to do is we need to educate to a certain level, people that don't know our business or not a part of our business, and bring it to a layman level. I think that when people understand what the circumstances are and what the issues are and what the risk is, and that they perhaps have to sign off on that risk, it changes the entire landscape and the circumstances. Let's say, we got to talk business. We got to learn how to communicate as security professionals too, in a manner that makes sense to the folks that we're actually speaking to.
If you're talking to the CFO, you're talking about money. If you're talking to the COO, you're talking about operational efficiencies and performance. But ultimately, you have to get them to agree that if they're going to take the risk, they've accepted it with you. And so our job is to educate them in their terms so they can understand the risks that we're talking about.
One of the questions I get a lot from mid-market and SMB customers is, what's enough security? Do I spend enough on security? And I've heard some interesting rules of thumb. I've heard you should spend about 15% of your IT budget on security. Some people will say you have to pay enough so that the business is operating. Some people will say you have to pay enough so long as you're compliant. But the biggest question I get is, do I have enough security today? So Sherry, you deal with really high level folks in public sector, and how do you help them when they throw up their arms and say, so Sherry, what's enough security for my department, or let alone my agency?
I always say the same thing. It doesn't matter where I work, and that is what are you trying to protect? Yeah. What is it that you actually want to protect? So, if you're in an organization, whether it's the private or the public sector, what is your goods, your crown jewels, your important information? Is it information? What is it you're trying to achieve? And then what would happen if you lost that? So that's one good question I always say is, okay, if you have all of this and this is so important to you and you lose this, then how valuable is that to you?
Hey, Steve, when you get that question in your advisory role, and people say, hey, what's enough here? Is it the compliance aspects? Is it doing the pen testing? Is it doing security awareness training? Is it having a properly configured firewall? I get a lot of that. Is it, John, do I have to buy your entire portfolio in order to have enough security? Or how do you?
To which you say yes.
Shamelessly, right? Yeah.
So to me, it kind of comes back to what's your goal and what's your industry. So in financial services, you're really kind of protecting trust. And I think Sherry made a great point there. And so if you're protecting trust, you're probably going to invest more, because that's huge. And once you lose it, it's gone. I don't know if you'll survive. If you're trying to avoid fines and be compliant, that's a different type of investment, different goals, easier to quantify, easier to pursue. Does that meet the expectations of your customers? And in that class action lawsuit, you've got to answer the question of, did you practice due care and diligence expected of somebody in your role? The other thing I like to do is change the question and say, are we effectively using the money?
Yeah.
And that's a better conversation. And what is the amount of mitigation we're getting for the amount we're spending?
Yep, absolutely. So I want to shift the topic just slightly, because there's a lot of buzz about zero trust and a lot of buzz about SASE because we're working remotely. And so for the audience, zero trust is an idea that was born somewhere around 2009 by an analyst at Forrester. And he posited the idea that you shouldn't trust someone just because they're behind the perimeter, behind the firewall. So you should trust traffic inside the perimeter no more than you should trust traffic outside the perimeter. And so that becomes interesting, because it's only been in the last 90 odd days that the vast majority of our teams are now working remotely. and so not only is it a buzzword, but now it's a practical reality that people are scrambling to implement.
Everything that appears in zero trust in terms of securing the endpoint, modern sound cybersecurity approaches in general. So I think it's easy to get started with zero trust. Is it important to go away from all of the traditional models and traditional ways of securing access to the headquarters from a remote office? No, I don't think so. Is it essential to implement some of the methodologies espoused by zero trust? Absolutely, because it makes your network more secure, and it's exactly what an attacker is going to point their technology and tradecraft at.
Management, supervisory, and all these other folks to make sure that their employees are only getting what they need to do their job. And then if they do move, it's their responsibility to make sure that some of these things are noted. So I think it is going back to a lot of basics. And I think, like Andrew said, zero trust is essentially what we've been always striving towards anyway.
Right.
And it's just a good practicing model for how we should be, securing the organizations that we work for.
Hey, what's the biggest trend you think that the folks watching this should be mindful of in the next 3-odd years?
I think that there's the proverbial alphabet soup of cybersecurity architectures and new strategies and so on. I think one of the common threads that persist throughout them, and somebody said it earlier in the panel, is that of visibility and having visibility over your network and infrastructure. And what I mean by that is whether you're using a cloud-based system like Microsoft 365 or Amazon, you have work-from-home VPN users or traditional on-prem network and servers. It's to be able to have insight into what users are on your network, what are they doing, where is your data, how is it moving, and what other devices are on your network, and what exactly is their role and function, and are they being targeted?
Sherry, what are you advising your stakeholders to be mindful of going forward?
Well, I think that we're in the public sector, I think especially we're living in a completely different world than we were several months ago. So, knowing all that, we're sort of kind of taking our traditional methods of running an organization, public sector or whatnot, and how we manage our employees. And it's kind of got tossed out the window and we're starting fresh in some ways. So interesting times. And again, making sure that we've got that employee experience, because one thing I know, and I'm sure all of you know, is that if you don't give the tools to be able to do the job, they're going to find it somehow. Right. And they're going to go outside the organization wants you to use.
That's exactly what happens. That's probably my biggest worry is
and then you toss the monitoring out the door, right? So I mean,
right.
So we've got to try to ensure that we're actually meeting the business requirements, and I can't stress that enough. And it's so important now, especially with so many remote workers.
Terry, what are you telling your folks to be mindful of going forward?
So one of the things we want to do is we want to limit the attack surface, right? So a lot of companies that go into audit, they have a flat network. Everything's on the same VLAN. So the moment they get hit with a ransomware, everything's toast. So we want to make sure we chop this up, make sure that everything's all asset assigned. And the other thing is that if they don't have the expertise in house, right? The whole I have my IT guy, I've got it covered. It's to partner up with an outside security firm that can complement their services. Yeah. Right. Because the IT guy cannot do it all. So it's better to team up with a cyber guy. And of course, as Sherry mentioned, the awareness training is going to be key.
I think that's a really good topic for folks to be mindful of moving forward, is that security really isn't a DIY exercise, right? And it fights that fundamental urge among security people, because we're all control freaks, right? We want to have complete visibility, we want to have complete control, and we want people to obey us. Somewhere along the way, you realize you can't cover all the bases. So Steve, you're the last one on the lineup. What are you telling people to be mindful of going forward?
I think I want to take more of a programmatic approach, and I think we need to take a look at how we're managing our risk register. And when we see something new, like the mage carts and the JavaScript environment attacks, how do we go out and establish situational awareness, even if it's usually just a snapshot? What's in that JavaScript environment? Marketing's put stuff in there. Everybody's put different things in that environment. How am I what would it cost to mitigate the risk? Take that up, get a decision, and then either put it on the risk register or fund fixing that. So kind of that programmatic a pursuit of reviewing, building a business case, and putting it on the risk register.
Hey, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. It's amazing how fast 20 minutes goes by in a cyber second, as it were. So again, the panelists, my hat's to all of you. You guys have such great insights and experiences. I don't know how we could have done it. I definitely want to do this again. So until we meet again, so long for now. Thanks again.
Thank
Thanks.
you. Bye-bye.